Hello everyone, welcome to my mini lecture on capital budgeting. I will start with a big picture first of all. In a corporate world where ownership and management is different, the most acceptable goal for a company is to maximize shareholders' wealth or maximizing current share price. One key decision that contributes to this value maximization is the investment decision. So investment decision basically involves identifying an asset or a project that's worth is more than its cost. Investment decision, in other words, known as capital budgeting decision. So capital budgeting decision is identifying a project that adds value to a company. Now let's see some big investment decisions that have been taken by companies in recent years. For example, Facebook acquires WhatsApp for $22 billion. Glaxo spent $6.6 billion on research and development. ExxonMobil commits about $7 billion to develop WellSense. So if you wonder that how companies select this type of multi-billion dollar investment projects, that's our focus today. So we will discuss capital budgeting process, different capital budgeting techniques, their advantages and disadvantages. So the main question today that we will be answering is, what is the systematic way of selecting an investment project that adds value to a company? Now, the next obvious question you can have, that why it's important to answer the central question today. Is it only because it's part of our curriculum, or does it have any other relevance? Well, capital investment decision is very important for the companies. Every year, companies commit hundreds of billions of dollars in capital investment projects. A good investment decision can add significant value to a company, whereas a bad investment decision can destroy a company. If you look at this example, in Australia between 2015 to 2016, mining companies have invested about 100 billion in capital investment projects, and these are invested by non-mining companies. So capital investment projects are not only important for the companies, they also contribute significantly to the overall GDP of a country. You can see here in this graph. Now, capital budgeting process typically involves estimating future cash flows of a project and comparing them with initial investment to decide whether to accept or reject a project. There are a range of different capital budgeting techniques. They are broadly divided into two categories: discounted cash flow technique and non-discounted cash flow techniques. Discounted cash flow techniques depend on estimating present value of future cash flows of a project. Present value means current value of a future cash flow, and non-discounted cash flow technique does not depend on estimating present value of future cash flows. So we first start with payback period. Payback period is the length of time future estimated cash flows of a project require to recover its initial investment. So shorter the payback period, better it is. Accept reject decision of a project based on payback period is sort of judgmental. Companies typically have a maximum acceptable payback period, and if payback period of a project is shorter than that, the project will be accepted, otherwise it will be rejected. Well, payback is simple to calculate, that's why it's still being used by many finance managers. However, it has some problem as well. First of all, payback does not consider time value of money. That's why it's not a very sensible capital budgeting technique. It also does not consider cash flows after the payback period. We have an example here where we have different projects. Each has an initial investment of $2,000. For project A, $500 recovers in year 1 and year 2 each, and $5,000 is recovered in year 3. So you can see that initial investment $2,000 is recovered sometime in year 3. That's why payback period for project A is 3 years. Now, if maximum acceptable payback for this company is somewhat higher than 3 years, then we will accept this project. The next one is net present value. NPV is the difference between the present value of future estimated cash flow of a project and its initial investment. So this is how we calculate present value, the estimated cash flows of a project discounted by the required rate of return or the opportunity cost of capital, which is indicated by R. So NPV is the difference between initial investment and present value of future cash flows. Here is the decision rule for NPV. If NPV of a project is positive, we will accept it, otherwise we will reject. 3 points to be remembered about NPV. First of all, it considers time value of money. That means it recognizes that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, because today's dollar can be immediately reinvested to generate earning. It also solely depends on forecasted future cash flows and opportunity cost of capital, so it's not affected by firm's choice of accounting method or profitability of the projects. And it also exhibits an additivity principle, since NPV is presented in current dollar. If we have multiple projects, we can simply add the NPVs of the projects to get an equivalent to an accumulated value of the projects. Here is an example where we have $700,000 as an initial investment of a project, and cash flows generated in year 1 and year 2 are $30,000 and $870,000. To calculate NPV, we will first find out the present value of these cash flows by discounting them using opportunity cost of capital, and then we will deduct initial investment from the sum of these present values. And since NPV for this project is positive, we will accept this project. Next, internal rate of return, IRR. IRR equates the present value of future cash flows of a project with initial investment. As a result, NPV becomes 0. The decision rule is if IRR is greater than cost of capital of a project, we will accept it, otherwise we will reject it. Intuitively, we can understand that if a project generates a return higher than its cost of capital, the project should add value to a company. Here is an example where we have initial investment of a project is $4,000 and cash flows to be generated are $2,000 and $4,000 respectively in year 1 and year 2. We discount these cash flows using IRR and set the equation to 0. And if we solve for IRR, we find that it is 28.08%. If the cost of capital project is less than this rate, then we will accept this project. IRR also has some problem. First of all is multiple IRR. If a cash flow is a non-conventional cash flow, that means if a cash flow stream has a negative cash flow in the interim period apart from the initial investment, then the cash flow may have multiple IRR, which may be misleading. If we have more than one projects and they are mutually exclusive and the magnitude or pattern of the cash flows are different, then IRR can be misleading. For example, we have two projects, Project D and Project E. Project D has an IRR of 100%, whereas E has an IRR of 75%. So D is preferable based on IRR. However, if we calculate NPV, we see E is preferable. It happens due to the difference in the magnitude of the project's cash flow. Last of all, internal rate of return can become difficult to calculate when the cost of capital varies over time. IRR also assumes that interim cash flows are reinvested at the IRR of this project, which is not a very reasonable assumption, whereas NPV assumes that interim cash flows are reinvested at the cost of capital, which is more reasonable assumption. That's why NPV is considered to be a superior capital budgeting technique compared to others. Now let's see how these capital budgeting techniques are used in reality. A survey was conducted in the United States among the chief financial officers of companies, and you can see that 75% of them responded that they use NPV as capital budgeting technique, and 76% responded that they use IRR. A similar survey was conducted in Australia, and you can see now the rates are even higher. For example, 94% responded that they use net present value, and 80% responded that they use internal rate of return. I also did a little bit of research on Australian companies about their capital budgeting practices, and you can see that these companies, BHP, Rio Tinto, Adelaide Brighton, they report in their annual report that they use NPV as capital budgeting technique. So to summarize, today we have discussed capital budgeting process, different capital budgeting techniques, and their advantages and disadvantages. So that's all of my discussion on the capital budgeting practices or capital budgeting techniques today. Thank you. Now I will be talking about my teaching philosophies and teaching approaches that I have adopted in my mini lecture on capital budgeting. I have placed this slide side by side so that it becomes easier to relate my teaching philosophy and approaches with my short lecture. So I have three main teaching philosophies. First of all is promoting active learning and critical thinking, then integrating research in teaching, and finally development through communication. So first of all is active learning and critical thinking. I believe that students should not only be equipped to take a test, they also should be able to use the knowledge they learn in classes several years down the road. That's why students must be active learners. Students must be able to critically think that how the knowledge they learn can be used in different domains of their lives. To this end, every session I start with providing a big picture where I explain the main theme in a very simplistic manner without any jargon so that students have an easy access to the topic. After that, we come up with either a video or some images or some catchy examples to attract students towards the topic so that students get intimately involved from the very beginning. Next, I formulate a central question for each session. So this question gives students a direction of the session since the lecture will be evolving around the central question. Since the next obvious query students may have that why it's important to answer this question, my next role is to motivate the discussion where I come up with some statistical information or a graphical presentation or might be a video where I show that how answering this question or understanding this lesson may be helpful in their future potential role in corporations or how they are important for the corporations or economy as a whole so that students get motivated to take part in the lesson. Then I generalize the discussion. I take a typical approach. I discuss the topic. I provide numeric examples. I also provide visual presentations, visual examples. For example, this. And I also present my topics in such a way so that students get different perspective. For example, I have provided two survey results today, one from US perspective and another from Australian perspective. My next role is to make the discussion real. So what that means is I bring real companies in my discussion to show that the lesson or the topic that we are learning is not only academic, it's being used by the companies in the real world. So students can appreciate the practical implication of a session. Next, I keep people involved in the session. Well, I adopt different approaches to keep people involved in the session. Particularly relevant to today's topic, I would ask students to answer the central question that I have presented earlier. I would ask students to be divided into different groups and write a response on this question. I have presented a number of numeric examples. So as a follow-up, I will ask students to solve similar problems. And I would ask students to select companies, look at their annual reports to find out their capital budgeting practices. My next teaching philosophy is integrating research in teaching. So I use research experience and research knowledge in explaining a topic or a formula or a theory. And I also use research evidence to let students understand that how a particular theory, concept, or a tool is used in reality by the companies. For example, I have reported one research findings that was published in a paper in Journal of Financial Economics, and this is also a research findings that was published in a paper of Australian Journal of Management. So these evidences let students appreciate the practical use of the topic. And my last teaching philosophy is development through communication. So I keep asking students questions. I get response from them to understand how students are getting the lesson, how students are understanding. So I identify hard or complex topics or students might face difficulties with. And at the end or towards the end of the class, I provide a summary. I repeat those points, those appear difficult or complex. I redefine the way I explain them so that students can easily understand them. So that's the end of my discussion on my teaching philosophy and approaches that I have adopted in my short lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.